We start with a basic question, defining the modernity eras. How do you define the modernity in South Indian context? Is it a continuation of a tradition or departure from it? So I'll first go to the Balu.
It's wrongly written as Balu and Babu, Thaliath, without Y. Anyway, so when I talk about modernity, I am inclined to talk about modernity from the philosophical perspective. That's my area, and also the historical perspective. So we have to be clear about one thing. Now, the theme is the South Indian modernity. So it combines two terms. One is a particular, which is South Indian, a regional identity within India and India within the globe. But modernity is universal. So even if you try to delineate or particularize or our modernity from the European modernity, it will fail because it has a universal claim. It has a universal genesis, though it was, in some way you can say, as is well known, it was born in the Europe, but still the entire world shares the concept of modernity. So, how to define modernity? The concept of modernity appeared, first of all, in philosophy. That was in Europe after long decades of, as we call it now, the dark Middle Ages. It was not that dark, anyway, that we call it now in a very contrast way. It was not that dark. But still, it was a major transition from a dark Middle Ages into a new age. Yeah, so like modernity has different terms. In German, we call it Neuzeit, a new age. So that new age started in the 16th century with Descartes, with humanism, with Renaissance, and also the various humanists like Erasmus of Rotterdam, Thomas More, and many others who traveled across Europe. And there are many other factors that contributed to the genesis of modernity, like the printing, yeah, and printing means access to the work, yeah, translating Bible, in England, Luther in Germany and all, and actually all over the world, the translation happened in literature, in India also. So then the advent of sciences from a long phase of philosophy in medieval scholasticism with Descartes and Cartesian. That was the divergence in philosophy between philosophy of mind and philosophy of the body, which is the mechanical philosophy. And from mechanical philosophy, first the mathematical sciences emerged like mechanics and optics, and later the physics, the chemistry, and many other branches. So I would say modernity is primarily and still it's a scientific modernity. So there's a very interesting work by Stephen Gaukro, who passed away, who is a major philosopher of science, and one of his opus magnum is science shaping modernity. So his argument is, so both Descartes in philosophy and science in the early modern time, they were fighting against this long phase of scholastic dogmatism, yeah? Whereas dogma comes from doxa, from a belief system. So the main challenge is to establish a knowledge system that should replace a belief system. Now, obviously, that belief system, like appropriated by the religions, yeah, will be negated in some sense. So, like Panofsky says, end of theocracy and the beginning of anthropocracy, right? But then it adds to the modernity with the Cartesian. There are many, people always associate Descartes with modernity, classical modernity, from philosophy. And obviously the Galileo and Newton and Robert Hooke, Kepler and many others in the early modern scientists. But there are various sources of modernity in Europe. This is what I want to emphasize. It was not just a coincidence that modernity started in the 16th century. It has a long history of oppression, mental slavery, and actually violence. So interestingly, the modernity was born in violence in Europe. And the best example would be the Spanish history. So the reconquisition of Spain started from the 10th century and ended in the 15th century. And there are early accounts of the traits of modernity in that period. First time they started doubting. So modernity always has a root in the doubt, in the skeptics. Yeah? And that paved way to a modern thought. Yeah, that's a famous Cartesian doubt, you can call it at all. But not just Descartes, that's my point. Not just Descartes, Hamlet, for example, Faust, Don Quixote. So all over Europe, these figures emerge, challenging the traditional dogmatic belief system. So that is the birth of modernity in Europe. Then in its progress, you can identify three clear enlightenment in Europe. The first is the English Enlightenment, Cromwell. Second, the French Revolution with Rousseau and Voltaire and many others. Third is I would say the most, in a way, important, philosophically, flavored modernity of Immanuel Kant. Yeah. So it's over a period of 3-4 centuries, this modernity established in Europe, and with the main characteristics that it placed the human mind in the center, replacing any other, sources outside. That's a famous, pre-critical work of Immanuel Kant, Was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? Yeah. So the main idea is you should have the courage to think for yourself. I mean, what you do normally, you outsource everything. For legal matters, you have a lawyer. For spiritual matters, you may have a priest. You have a doctor. Not that you become a doctor. But then the thinking, you should have the autonomy of thinking. So he said, sapere aude. That means have the courage to think for yourself. So that anthropocracy, the rule of the understanding, that starting with Descartes and moving to John Locke and Berkeley, Hume and Kant and Leibniz and on, going on. So this has shaped the modernity in Europe. Yeah, so I'm just giving an idea. And one more characteristic is this is also an obsession of the human mind to singularity and identity, which I will explain later.
No, my question is, when it comes, when we call it the South Indian modernity, my question is very simple. Is it a continuation for us, or a continuation of our tradition, or it is kind of a departure from it? What do you think, sir?
I think we should also understand its invention. Partly, we should understand every development is invention as well as departure. Therefore, for us, the modernity is partly invention. It is invention in a sense that some of those institutions were created for the first time with universal access, education, courts. These things were created only with this. Therefore, when we talk about modernity, South Indian modernity, we are looking at creation of universal institutions. And the moment we start looking at creation of these universal institutions, we also try to look at literary evidences to understand what does it actually mean. I'm going to actually draw from two languages, Tamil and Malayalam, to understand this interesting trajectory of what I call South Indian modernity. For me, South Indian modernity is rooted in materialism. It looks at body as real. The Tamil word for body is called Mei. Mei means real. The moment body is seen as real, you try to address hunger, you try to address illness. Therefore, it is not a mythical concern, it's a real concern. Therefore, at some level, the centrality of this modernity is looking at body as real. And the moment we start looking at body as real, what are the things we gain? The Tamil poetry says that the good king is a person who is a pasipini maruthuvan. That is the person who addresses illness and hunger. Is the best ruler, which means there's a particular definition which is getting embedded. And the moment we realize that there is an embeddedness of universal values into these, suddenly it opens up in a very interesting manner. There is an interesting negotiation between peninsular India. For instance, much earlier, Vaikom Muhammad Bashir had written a short novel called My Grandfather Had an Elephant. That My Grandfather Had an Elephant got translated in Tamil as Even My Grandfather Had an Elephant. And then it moves to Karnataka and it says that whose grandfather did not have an elephant. There was a way that entire Bashir's consciousness traveled, which means there is an internal dialogue within the region. What is happening is that we seem to be missing this internal dialogue which is happening within the region. And if we understand that there is an internal dialogue which is happening within the region, we can understand the impact of somebody like Ilayaraja or somebody like M.S. Vishwanathan. See, M.S. Vishwanathan is again a very interesting person. He had composed the music for the Tamil national anthem, Tamil Thai Varthu. His mother tongue is Malayalam. Which means there is an interesting dialogue within the region. When we are talking about southern modernity, I notice that at least with Sahitya Academy Award winning writers, most of them, their mother tongue is some other language. The Kannada writers whose mother tongue is Tamil, like Mastri Venkatesa Iyengar, we can have a list. A number of Telugu speaking people who have won the literary award in Tamil are legion, which means there is an interesting internal dialogue in the region. And this interesting internal interaction is the one which makes this modernity much more enduring. And that's the reason it gives an idea of Dravidian or Dakshin or Peninsular or whatever the name we would like to give is different. But there is a collective identity of not trying to surrender our idea to a universal hold of holding together a principle, but celebrating this idea of coming together. Therefore, for me, South India represents the spirit of coming together, and that's what I feel as South Indian modernity.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting observation about the South Indian modernity. I'm going to the next question, which is like, Sudipta Kaviraja suggests, modernity in India is basically a state project. Because with unlike Europe, here modern state came first, and then that modern state started to bring the modernity project as a scheme it is. Because that use the constitution as a tool to bring this modern ideas to society, like whether it is about the untouchability, eradicating the untouchability, we brought through the constitution we tried. So that here this comes, do you think that this narrative should understood differently in the South Indian context? Because since why I'm asking this question, because the idea of reservation in Karnataka with Nalvadi Kasaraj Odair, who's a king, introduces. It's not as such a modern state project. So then, with this contradiction, do we have to understand this state modernity as a state scheme in South India?
That's a very interesting question, but we have to be very clear about the definitions and the terminology which is used. I mean, the people over the time just forget the semantic and think that these are connected. It's true that the modernity in Europe created the national states. So the birth of national states like France, Germany, England, Spain, everything, in a way, it's a product of modernity, right? But you should not confuse nationalism with modernity. This is my point. It's actually against the nationalism, because normally we are inclined to think modernity in a singular way, in the sense that it is the modernity that allowed us to identify us as having an identity in a singular way. It's not. It's not. Because the modernity is exactly the opposite, that I would argue. So I don't know. I came across a book which is very interesting. Well, I should have read that earlier. It's just recently a book by a Jewish philosopher, uh, Yirmiyahu Yovel, who passed away, who was in Israel and later in America, in New York, I think. It's about the other within. So it deals with the problem of identity of the converted crypto Jews, the converted, who were the converted Jews who were called conversos in the 13th and 14th century Spain, and who were condemned or put to trial, being accused of practicing Judaism secretively. These are the crypto Jews, which was true in certain sense, because if you convert from someone from a religion which was practiced over many centuries into Christianity, he cannot simply transform into a new Christian, right? But the point is not that. It's not that there is an other within. It is not just for a converso, it is for everyone. So the other within, which creates an inner dialectic, this should lead to the modernity, not that singularism. So unfortunately, all of us, the humankind, has an obsession to singularity. So that we inherit from the philosophy. If you observe the philosophies from the East to the West, the philosophers were obsessed with one identity. For the pre-Socratians, it was one basic substance out of which the entire multiplicity of this world emerged. And then there is the unity of ideas, and again with the Neoplatonism, the Plotin, yeah, or later on the subject or the substance. So you create terms in all this out of your obsession with singularity, and think that identity is a singularity. But there are various studies by Levinas and many others that this kind of is exactly the opposite. That in fact there are many identities in me, which is some are dormant, some are very deep, and some may resurrect, or some may have died out, whatever. So I'm a synthesis of various identities. So if I come to the Kerala history, what was Kerala geographically? Actually cut off from the mainland India because of the Western Ghats. Of course, there were migrations and influences from Tamil Nadu, from the north, etc. But then most of the influence came from the ocean, the Arabian Sea. So it was more open to the world, to Rome, for example, to the Arabia, to Israel, etc., etc. So, but I'm not exaggerating that. But then the place and the movement of this kind of cultural influence, which played an important role. So, as a result of which, it still remains a different state, historically and politically. Why? Because to create a singular identity is extremely difficult in that stage. And that paved the foundation, that laid the foundation of the Kerala modernity, I would say. So, I mean, I don't want to explicate this, because to my mind, this is one state where no one can claim majority or minority. So the concept of majority and minority somehow blurs, is blurred in Kerala because of the history of even the minorities and their strength also. And also the influence from, when we talk about the region, territory and nationalism and all, we don't think about sea. We don't think about the ocean. And there are a lot of interesting studies by Delimitation about why the seas should be included in all this. What all came from the sea. So we don't know what is. So we have a long history of lot of migration and the exodus and the mixing and remixing of cultures, etc. So this because of that, it is equally difficult to define an identity and an otherness. Only when you have a single identity, you will start othering, for example. So in Europe and also in India, for example, the modernity has a common denominator, which is the heterogeneity of different identities. And those identities are not final, absolute, or singular. They are only tendencies. So I can say, I have an identity of this particular religion, whatever, but this is not a finality. It's a tendency. So you have to be very clear about this underlying dialectical currents in the concept of identity. In a way, it's a Hegelian dialectics of a inner.
See, for me, the interesting aspect is the incremental changes. If you're looking at affirmative actions, is it clear? Yeah. Affirmative action. South India, which started with reservation, now it has become institutionalized. Inheritance rights for women, it happened here, which means every affirmative action seems to have an entrenched behavior here. Therefore, when I talk about modernity, I look at how these things got itself entrenched. Therefore, nobody is now in South is getting worked up over any affirmative action. They feel that the affirmative action is not going to take away any of my privileges. I look at affirmative action in a far more easy way of it is empowering somebody else. That understanding. Therefore, when we talk about Southern modernity, we talk about the 150 years history of these incremental changes. Therefore, the communal GO was in 1926. The first ever affirmative action. Women's inheritance rights first was mooted in 1932. If you are looking at all these things, what do we mean by South Indian modernity? We are looking at some sort of a consciousness of people who voted against a particular national party thrice in 3 successive elections. In 2014, when Narendra Modi led the campaign slogan in Tamil Nadu was, "Is it Modi or Lady?" Jayalalitha led the campaign with the slogan called "It's Modi or Lady," and Lady won. Which means there is a particular political dynamics to it. Therefore, I am not seeing at it in isolation. It happened in 2014, it happened in 2019, and it happened now. What makes this region respond in a different manner? What makes this region look at issues in a far more inclusive manner? How does it look at the factors which are homogenizing as a problematic one and which are helping heterogeneous tendencies to thrive as the one with which we have to develop a relationship? These things are all deeply embedded in this. And that is the reason you also find regional political aspirations getting articulated in these areas. Therefore, there can be a Telangana party, there can be a regional party in Tamil Nadu, there can be a regional party in Kerala. For that entire multiple articulation, which is against the homogenization, is the central for what I call as the South Indian modernity. And these are actually available in bits and pieces. We don't have a concrete model to say that this is South Indian model. But we can actually piece this South Indian model using multiple pieces.
So in a way, all South Indian states has got kind of ruled by the regional parties in a way, because though it is Karnataka, which is Siddaramaiah, which is not Congress party as such. When it comes to Kerala, it is LDF and UDF. It's Kerala's own invention in that kind. it is Telangana, Telangana Rashtriya Samiti, or Andhra Pradesh, which is, again the Jagans. Why this, do you think this is also kind of a product of South Indian modernity, you do feel? Because it was not like that when the first election happens everywhere, it was Congress. And then there is no, from last 20-25 years, there is no national party or the national leader is influential in this part of India. Is this something which defines the South India's modern tradition?
Well, I doubt, because in Kerala it's both LDF and UDF. UDF is the Congress. No, I mean there are some regional Kerala Congress and this and that, but majorly it is Congress, which is a national party. And LDF is more than national, it is universal. So I don't really agree with that observation. And I want to argue against that. What happened in Kerala is it was the first democratically elected government, left government in the world, democratically elected, 1952. Yeah, and the Deshiya Prasthan, Kerala had a huge contribution in that. So one difference is, for example, why the Keralite has to be a nationalist, or as compared to someone from Allahabad, which is very close to this movement, the Nehru family and all this. Kerala had always this problem of being cut off, being isolated from the mainstream. That's a clear thing, geographically and historically. But out of that isolation, what happened was a striving. It has reflected everywhere. It has reflected in the politics, in the history, in the trade, in accepting the foreign influence in education and health sector. I can also include Shankaracharya, from a far south going all over India to re-establish I mean, of course, recapture it from the Buddhism, whatever. Yeah. So there is a striving in that in us out of this historical isolation. So being in the mainstream, people think that it's the advantage of modernity and national identity. It is not. And I always think in a logical way, sometimes it's better to be an outsider. You cannot be thrown out. If you're an outsider, how can you be thrown out? Only the insider can be thrown out. No, the modernity and nationalism, if you think as singularities, then you support that insider status, which is dangerous, which can lead to totalitarian states, which can lead to oppression and all. But Kerala had that advantage of being an outsider, historically and politically, whatever, and that's why it could sustain that modern nature for a long time until date.
No, actually, for me, the key question is, what are the obvious clues we are going to take? For me, the clues were, one, as I said earlier, affirmative action. The next clue for me is democratization of the space. I think spread of print, which democratized knowledge, is the one which makes this modernity a real. Therefore, this is modernity. When you are talking about southern modernity, we are also talking about a southern print culture which emerged in all the 4 languages and which had a huge public sphere. And that public sphere actually contributed towards generating this debate. And the fact that we are having debate is the one which is not permitting us to become slaves for a WhatsApp university, but to question what has been handed over to us. Therefore, for me, this modernity is the ability to question. And the moment you understand this ability to question is being rooted in the idea of knowledge and the knowledge economy and the role of print and the huge spread of technology. All these things play a vital role in understanding what we call as South Indian modernity.
That's very true. It's a very important point. This kind of, I mean, to my mind, the birth of modernity, whether it's in Europe or in Kerala. I want to make that point too. So we think that, oh, this is something imported from Europe to us through colonial processes, not just the British, even the Portuguese, whatever you add to it. But it's not. So there are a lot of studies. We actually share the modernity. Actually, we have a shared history. I mean, of course, well, in India, we can claim that, Kerala claim that. What happened in Europe, in some way happened here also, through the influence of Christianity, because even 30 years of war between Protestants and Catholics happened in Kerala also. And before that, at the end of Reconquista and the beginning of Inquisition, it reflected in Kerala also. We just survived Inquisition, Portuguese Inquisition, where Goa didn't. So all this happened. There is a shared history. And I know one historian who was in Freiburg, where I studied, Jürgen Osterhammel, who is quite well known in the continental space about this shared history. So there is, I mean, it may not be very, very visible, like, for example, translation. And as he said, printing, translation into modern philologies. In Europe, it was from Latin to English, German, Spanish, etc. But here also that happened at the same time. Edithan translating, Ramayana in Kerala into vernacular Malayalam, which was earlier not. So that made, kind of, not just to popularize this, but the access to these things. Yeah. So the technology and the printing and reading it in the ordinary language. And this is clearly the advent of a knowledge system. So what I want to make this point is, it's always a fight between an imposed belief system and an emerging knowledge system. And of course, you say in philosophy, knowledge is a justified belief. Well, it is just one observation. It is not. And even you trace it back to Plato, it is not doxa, it is episteme, which has a different genesis and which has a different method also. It's not just a belief, justified is not knowledge. So a belief system will always try to oppress the knowledge system. And I think, to my mind, the advantage of these southern states, which were historically isolated from the mainstream India in some way, and out of isolation is freedom in some way, and you think differently. Yeah. So you don't think in a singular identity. You may think in the multiple identities. You may become inclined to a heterogeneous culture, etc., etc. So I think that knowledge system overcoming the belief system, that there lies the root of modernity, even in South India.
Let us take to the another aspect of the present challenge, which is the communal politics. This communal politics is essentially anti-modern, but it uses all the modern tools, from the technology to the statecraft. You name anything, they're using it. And how do we explain this paradox? Particularly in the context of South India, because the state like Karnataka, which went to BJP, and in all other states, there is that this communal politics is kind of, it is emerging, and we don't know. It is it was like in Karnataka also, we all thought nothing is going to happen, but one day the Yediyurappa became chief minister of the elected BJP government. So this is happening in all 4 or 5 states now. So everywhere they're getting stronger and stronger, and using, from the national level, they're using statecraft, they're using WhatsApp University, they're using every other tool. So how do we understand and how do we explain this? So over to you.
How I wish I were an indoctrinated parrot to answer this question. Really, it's a big challenge. We don't know how to deal with this. Only thing which is very clear is that this 100 odd years of modernity has given us language to understand the fault lines. Therefore, at least we know where the fault lines are. Therefore, we know that here is a communal fault line, here is a caste fault line. Therefore, what is happening in South India is that at least our idea has been drawn towards the fault lines, and we know that these fault lines are there. Beware of these fault lines. It doesn't mean that we are safe. It doesn't mean that we have already reached our destination. But this has given us an idea of fault lines. And that is the most important one. And I don't see this fault lines as a dangerous mark, but as a very important mid-course correction. The moment we start looking at these clarion calls as mid-course correction, and if we are able to make right correction, we are in a far better position. Are we taking lessons from these signals? That I don't know. But there are signals, and the time has come for us to take the right lessons from these signals. See, 2014 was the first clear example of India voting in two different manner. Peninsular India voted in a completely different manner. And that is getting replicated repeatedly, which means there is a particular idea of what constitutes a modern nation. This I have been saying it for some time, that there are two imaginations. One is the imagination of people who rule, where their idea is holding together, and citizens, where the idea is coming together. There at some level, South India represents this idea of coming together, as opposed to the idea of a nation state of holding together. So how do we understand this difference? That difference cannot be explained with one seat. It can be explained only when you look at the region. And the region gives a clear indication that this region has a different imagination. That's the reason South is so worried about the new delimitation exercise. Because that new delimitation exercise is going to convert the entire demographic dividends based purely on population count. It's not going to take into account any other contribution. Therefore, my ability to control my fertility level is going to be used to penalize me. Therefore, when you're talking about the southern modernity, all these things are embedded into it.
I think, see, when you, first of all, when you say South India, so it doesn't mean that, as you asked, like why the results were different in South India. It's not that Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra collectively thought together. No, there's nothing like that. And as he clearly said, so it's a different imagination. And also, historically, as I want to repeat what I said, some form of autonomy derived out of isolation also in the history of India. That's very clear. And I just want to make a point. We think that, everything progresses with time because our thoughts are fashioned by science and technology. Science obviously progressed, technology obviously progressed, and the infrastructure, applied science through the applied. But society may not progress like that. And I strongly doubt, have we ever progressed from the 50s? In our political sensibility, in our secular mind and all. So now the Europe is slowly realizing, no, it was not a progress. What is happening in Europe and the West. So at the social level, it may not progress. We may actually lose one by one what we have already gained. So having said that, still I believe, I don't want to go into details of this kind of political thing. This always happened. Like in Kerala, it was always a kind of shuttling between CPM and Congress, So that's also a feature of the politics. But I would still consider this as a process of modernity. Not that, like Kant said, we are not living in an enlightened world, but we live in the enlightenment. So in a processual way. It's a part of that also.
Thank you. And the grand solutions, modernity always offers the grand solutions. Democracy is that kind of a grand solution in a way. So which is modernity offered, but in India, which is actually the modern state, which is, propagated the modernity in a different way because through its projects and scientific temper, whatever we say, the Nehruvian kind of a modern state project it is. But at the same time, at the when our constitution proposes all these grand solutions, at the same time it also proposes micro solutions like the Panchayat Raj, or whether it's the cooperative movement and these things. Don't you think that it's the time which is we have to shift from those grand solutions to the micro solutions to make the modernity is the more meaningful? So what's your take on this?
I would not like. Well, unfortunately, I must tell you, because I have a problem, because in the 80s and 90s, at least in 90s, we have been discussing intensively about how modernity was authored by postmodernism. That was the time of all this, from Lyotard to Derrida to Foucault and all this kind of postmodern discourse. Now, it didn't die out, but still, that's not the paradigm now. Yeah? I think that we have to think about that also. You think you don't project modernity beyond a point, even though like someone like Habermas say it's an unfinished project. But still, there are certain cracks developed in modernity also, necessarily, because the early modernity with all its optimism, ambitions, and which was realized in the advent of science and etc., ended up in extreme fascism, oppression, wars, etc. So don't forget that. And feudalism also. Feudalism is, by the way, a product of modernity also. National states and all. Colonial processes. So when you consider all this, I would still say even the concept of postmodernism, which was very prevalent in Europe. See, for example, Lyotard, who's saying that end of grand narrations, the end of grand narration, we cannot have this kind of huge narration of capitalism, Marxism, and many other things. It will collapse and then becomes various nodal points and a kind of fragmentation, various centers, etc., etc. But that was an ideal. So this is in the postmodern condition of knowledge, so which he wrote, assigned by a Canadian university. But that's not true at all. But still, these grand narrations exist. Still, I won't say they exist. The dream for that exists. That's the problem. The dream of great nation. Every nation say, make this great nation great, as if it was not great. This is a kind of a late summer, a late striving for a grand narrative, which is very dangerous, I must say. So modernity has to include that deconstruction of that grand narrative into a inclusive, participatory heterogeneity of identities. That is most important. So it should change that narrative.
See, a few years ago, in our library, we brought out a book on a music scholar called Terada. Terada uses a very interesting idea called nostalgia versus memory. He says that memory is helpful and nostalgia is problematic. And whenever we talk about modernity, we have to see whether we are using memory as a lens or nostalgia as a lens. If you are going to use nostalgia as a lens, then this modernity is going to become extremely problematic. If you are going to use memory as a lens, then it's going to be an extremely transformative. But the key question is, what is the fundamental lens we are going to deploy? And the moment we are clear about that lens, it also gives an idea of what are the elements we are going to look at. Elements are these are the things which are empowering us. These are the elements which are limiting us. Therefore, that lens gives us the tools to understand the empowering tools and the limiting tools. Therefore, for me, that's the reason modernity is the one which is about transformation rather than limiting. Therefore, if we look at modernity as a transformating one, how do we look at it? That's a central question for me.
nostalgia and the memory. I will come to this, again I come back to communal politics, the historical narratives. What it does is that, it, it denies and dismisses the immediate past. For them, it's the immediate past is what was after 1947 or 1950 after we accepted our constitution. And they glorifies the ancient past. For them, it is, even democracy was there in that ancient past. Yeah. And the plastic surgery was there. So this is impacting more and more, I think, India in general, South India, more particular because of that, this kind of narrations coming as a political project. So how one should respond to this?
I think South had responded to it in a interesting manner. It deployed humor. For instance, Tamil writer Pudumai Pittan, when people were trying to push Tamil antiquity by many years, he said that if we go by this narrative, first monkey should have been a Tamil monkey. Therefore, what happened is we use interesting humor to puncture these claims. Therefore, when idea of first surgery happened here, they said that, why not look at Ganesha? And that entire Ganesha story was being ridiculed. Therefore, what has happened is people use humor to counter this. I think that has been embedded in this entire thing. Therefore, whenever we talk about modernity, we also use how people use humor to counter these claims.
Well, I think the major problem here is all this kind of speculation, which is not new in the history. In every advent of this kind of governance. So there is a nostalgia very clearly, but the problem is you unnecessarily speculate on marginal discourses and neglecting the main discourses completely. For example, I can give you everything was there in India. For example, differential calculus. There is a lot of studies going on that the fluxions, the 300 years before or for more than that, Newton and Leibniz proposed that, for Leibniz it was from the principle of continuity, and for Newton from dynamics, the discovery of calculus. So the Kerala mathematician, I think Thomayaji, in fact there is a reference in a verse about the infinitely, decline or the diminishing quantities. The point is, it's not enough just to postulate that. The calculus has a long history from Leibniz and Newton over Bernoulli or Lagrange and many others, and they developed and worked into, because Europe for it was an existential process. My point is not that. When you claim that and project in such a way, it went from here, which is not true at all, because all over the world people can think alike, because the human mind encountering the reality has certain commonalities, whether you are in Europe, America, India, Asia, China, wherever. So there is a commonality. It's not that one influence goes to other, but there are influences too. But what you forget as main discourses, the decimal system, for example, and the geometry and many other things, astronomy. So this passed through the Persians or the Arabs. I mean, these main discourses you just forget. But to project that, you need education. So I think it's bad education, that lead to this kind of projecting the marginal discourse, which many are not true at all, but forgetting the main discourses.
It's almost 45 minutes, I believe, we've been talking. And I think, is there any, it's a time to open this forum to questions. I don't see much of the people. I think, is there any questions? Yeah, please.
Sir, my question is to both of Babu sir and Panisha. Sir, the modernity, you said affirmation and all. So that works, plowing the ground for the affirmative actions. Sri Narayana Guru in Kerala and Periyar in Tamil Nadu. So in the works of these two, we can see a radical activism from the Periyar side and a spiritual activism from the Sri Narayana Guru in Kerala. So how so currently the modernity shifted in these days in the politics and in the cultural context. The radical and spiritual traits are do we still can identify these traits still or not?
See, problem is assuming that these things are frozen forever is a assumption. These are constantly shifting one. For instance, if you take Tamil Nadu, Periyar is a major political influence, but Periyar is a person who didn't believe in religion, a theist. An atheist like Periyar has a huge supporter among believers in Tamil Nadu. How do we understand this entire thing? Therefore, our society is full of internal contradictions. Therefore, if you are going to look at purely contradictions, we may not be able to get an idea, but we have to look at these things as one complementing the other. Therefore, their atheism and theism were not contradicting, but atheism and theism were about human dignity. What connected Periyar and his supporters were the respect for dignity. What linked Narayana Guru and the changes in Kerala is the idea of dignity. Therefore, if we try to shift it to the conceptual framework which brought people together, we can see the last 150 years journey in a far more interesting manner.
In fact, this is a very interesting, I didn't not purposely, when you talk about the Kerala modernity, which is a major discourse in Kerala, of course, for some time now, for some years now, the reference is mainly the social reformers, like from Narayana Guru and, from Narayana Guru to Pannerselvan, if I include all these people, who were or the V.T. Pattudelipad and many others in various communities, also the Christian community has that. The point is, again, back to the concept of modernity. What happened at that time was, in philosophy, there are two major issues. One is the knowability or cognizability. The second is the existence. So the medieval scholasticism has this overemphasis of individuation, existence, and of course the fertile ground for dogmas and religious oppression and all this kind that happened. How the modernity with Descartes could overcome that by establishing a culture of knowability. So from Descartes to Kant, you see the progression of that rule of epistemology replacing a very problematic ontology earlier. That happened. So that existence that somebody is not the final. Yeah. So when Kant says, I would say this is the fundamental principle of every modernity, every reformation. I speak in German. The menschliche Würde is unantastbar. Human dignity is intact. You cannot touch it. Yeah? He says human dignity. That universalism we actually need. Yeah? And that comes from a culture of knowability, a culture of understanding, not from fixing the individuation and existence.
Hello, good afternoon. I have so many questions. I think I have a constraint. I can ask only few questions. One question. Okay. I think we are talking about South Indian. The I was listening almost 1 hour, and in the conversation, especially I think you people were talking about Kerala and Karnataka, and spoke about Tamil Nadu also. But if you look at these states, South Indian state, and he was talking about the delimitation also. South Indian state, it is not like, that when it comes to North Indian state, that we talk about a Hindi imposition and that one language, one culture. But when it comes to South India, it's a different language and a different culture. And it's just that assumption, South India, like, we have a different culture in Kerala, we have a different culture in Karnataka, and I think there is a similarities there, but the difference are there. So my question to this panel, we are talking about that in our expense, that is North India thriving, like delimitations, and for example, when we pay the tax, the majority amount is going to the North Indian side. So we have sacrificed, we have did all the aspect, state like Kerala and other state also. For financial aspect, the South Indian state is contributing more. And when it comes to that other index, when we talk about the Kerala model in education, and he was talking about health sector and other sector, Kerala is doing much far better than other state. But when it comes to the finance, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka is doing better than Kerala even. So my question to you guys, that if our concern is, that delimitations, first concern. Second concern, that that the central government trying to derail our development. So how we are going to face this issue? First point. Second point, that we have different culture, like how we say that South versus North. Thank you.
See, one thing was very clear, that delimitation is not going to be an easy exercise, primarily because the way it is being structured, it is going to penalize people who effected changes. Therefore, I don't think it's going to be such an easy exercise. The earlier delimitation exercise was deferred by 30 years. I think this delimitation exercise will be again deferred. Like the way we deferred the Hindi debate, which had a deadline of 1965, which has been now defied forever. This delimitation has to be defied, because delimitation has to also embed the idea of realizing certain developmental goals. Therefore, if the developmental goal is going to be the ultimate gender justice, which is fertility rate, the central aspect of fertility rate is respect for women's body. If South has achieved such a wonderful gender ratio, which means it has a far better gender justice embedded in its idea, that cannot be undermined. That's the reason I think this entire delimitation exercise is not going to be an easy exercise, but I'm not sure how long it's going to be delayed and how it is going to be reworked. But when we are reworking, it cannot be purely based on numbers alone. It has to take into account other factors for some sort of a federal balance.
I just want to again, going back to the old reference, that modernity is not unique in its history. No? It was earlier defined as the progress of science in Europe, for example, and then the empowering the nations, the advent of national states and colonial process. These are all parts of the modernity. But at least after the catastrophic Second World War, what happened with the Holocaust and all, what happened in Europe, the entire nations in Europe became social states, including England. Yeah? This concept is in danger, no doubt about that, after the neoliberal tendencies happened. So the point is, I would say, to my mind, someone who enjoyed that social state for some years in Germany, which doesn't really exist in that way. In India, I can say, with absolute confidence, it is Kerala which has achieved that somewhat, that social state status, welfare state and all. But then if you define again modernity going back to the old feudal structures like progress, becoming rich and rich and rich, whatever, you are creating a disparity between rich and poor. Yeah, because the distribution of the wealth, for example, I don't say the distribution of the wealth, distribution of chances, empowering the sectors which are historically oppressed, whatever. Yeah, and supposedly the main features of a social welfare state. If we lose that, as compared to the Europe, even, yeah, still they are, but we are going in a very fast way to demolish these structures.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time already. So I thank my panelists because it's a wonderful discussion.